The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift medical tent when Dr. Elena Vasquez heard the unmistakable crack of a sniper's rifle. She didn't flinch anymore. After 18 months in this war-torn region, the sounds of violence had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. What she didn't know was that in exactly 47 minutes, she would pick up a rifle for the first time in her life, and in doing so, change the course of an entire conflict. Elena had sworn an oath to save lives, not take them. But sometimes, the line between healing and protecting becomes so thin it disappears entirely. This is the story of how a woman who dedicated her life to mending broken bodies became one of the most feared and respected marksmen in modern warfare. It's a story about choices made in impossible moments, about the weight of a trigger finger, and about discovering strength you never knew existed. They called her the Angel of Death, a name that would have horrified the young medical student who once fainted at the sight of blood. But war has a way of revealing who we truly are beneath the surface, stripping away everything we thought we knew about ourselves until only our core remains. This is Elena's story. This is how a healer became a hunter, how compassion transformed into precision, and how one woman's courage in the face of unthinkable circumstances would echo through history long after the last shot was fired. Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her stethoscope against the chest of a young soldier, listening to the irregular rhythm of his heart. The medical tent swayed gently in the desert wind, its canvas walls providing little protection from the harsh realities outside. Elena had been working in this field hospital for over a year now, treating wounded soldiers from both sides of a conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. She had arrived here as part of Doctors Without Borders, driven by an idealistic desire to help those caught in the crossfire of war. Elena was 28 years old, with dark hair that she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. She had graduated top of her class from medical school and could have had her pick of prestigious positions in any major hospital. Instead, she chose to work in the most dangerous places on Earth. The soldier beneath her hands was barely 18, his uniform torn and bloodied from shrapnel wounds. Elena worked methodically, cleaning and dressing his injuries while speaking to him in gentle tones. She had learned early in her deployment that her voice could be as healing as any medicine. The young man's eyes followed her movements, finding comfort in her steady presence. Outside the tent, she could hear the distant rumble of artillery fire. The front lines were less than 5 miles away, close enough that they sometimes received wounded soldiers who were still bleeding from fresh injuries. Elena had grown accustomed to the sounds of war, though she never stopped feeling a tightness in her chest when the explosions grew too close. Her medical team consisted of 6 people, 2 other doctors, 3 nurses, and a medical assistant. They worked 18-hour days, catching sleep in brief intervals between waves of casualties. Elena had become their unofficial leader, not because of any formal rank, but because of her unwavering calm under pressure and her exceptional surgical skills. The current conflict had been raging for 3 years. It started as a civil war but had drawn in neighboring countries and international forces. Elena didn't pretend to understand all the political complexities. Her job was simpler and more immediate: save whoever came through the tent flaps, regardless of which side they fought for. She finished treating the young soldier and moved to the next patient, an older man with burns covering 40% of his body. Elena had seen too many burn victims in her time here. The weapons used in this war were particularly brutal, designed not just to kill but to maim and terrorize. She pushed down her anger as she worked, focusing instead on the task at hand. As evening approached, Elena stepped outside the medical tent to get some fresh air. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the military compound that had grown up around their hospital. She watched as trucks carrying supplies arrived from the main base, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez approached her, his boots crunching on the sandy ground. Marcus was the head of security for the medical compound, a career soldier who had been assigned to protect the medical personnel. He was in his early 40s, with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much combat. Over the months, he and Elena had developed a mutual respect and friendship. "How are you holding up, Doc?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. Elena looked back at the medical tent, where the soft glow of lanterns illuminated the silhouettes of her team still working. 19 patients today," she said. 3 didn't make it." Marcus nodded grimly. He had been a soldier for 20 years and understood the mathematics of war. Intelligence reports suggest enemy forces are planning something big, he said. We might see an increase in casualties over the next few days. Alina felt that familiar tightness in her chest. Every time they received advance warning of upcoming operations, she knew her team would be pushed to their limits. She had learned to prepare herself mentally for the waves of broken bodies that would inevitably follow. "We'll be ready," she said, though she wondered if anyone could ever truly be ready for the horror of war. That night, Alina lay in her small sleeping quarters, listening to the distant sounds of the conflict. She thought about her life before this deployment, about the comfortable apartment she had in San Francisco, about friends who worried about mundane problems like traffic and coffee shop wait times. That life seemed to belong to someone else now. She had chosen this path because she believed in the sanctity of human life. Every person who came through her tent deserved the best care she could provide, regardless of their nationality, their beliefs, or which army they served. It was a principle she held sacred, even as the war around her grew increasingly brutal and senseless. Alina didn't know it yet, but this principle would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Tomorrow would bring events that would force her to confront the limits of her medical oath and discover depths of courage she didn't know she possessed. The next morning began like any other. Alina rose before dawn, checked on the overnight patients, and prepared for the day ahead. She reviewed supply inventories with her team, noting that they were running low on several critical medications. A supply convoy was expected within the next few days, but timing was always uncertain in a war zone. Around mid-morning, the familiar sound of helicopters announced the arrival of new casualties. Alina's team immediately shifted into high-gear mode, preparing the operating table and gathering the necessary equipment. This was the rhythm of their lives, periods of relative calm punctuated by intense bursts of life-saving activity. The first helicopter disgorged 4 wounded soldiers, all suffering from the effects of a roadside bomb. Alina quickly triaged the patients, determining which injuries required immediate attention and which could wait. It was always a difficult calculus, made more challenging by limited resources and the ever-present possibility that more casualties would arrive before they finished treating the current batch. As she worked on the most critically injured soldier, Alina found herself thinking about the nature of healing. She had always seen her role as fundamentally hopeful. She was fighting against death, working to preserve life in the face of forces that sought to destroy it. But lately, she had begun to question whether her efforts were enough. For every life she saved, the war seemed to claim 10 more. For every soldier she healed and sent back home, 5 more arrived with injuries that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Alina was beginning to understand that in a conflict this intense and prolonged, even the act of healing became a form of defiance against the machinery of war. The soldier on her operating table was a woman about her own age, with blonde hair matted with blood and dirt. Alina worked carefully to remove shrapnel from near the woman's spine, knowing that one wrong move could result in permanent paralysis. As she operated, Alina couldn't help but wonder about this soldier's story. Did she have family back home? What had motivated her to serve in this distant conflict? After 4 hours of surgery, Alina successfully stabilized all 4 patients. As she cleaned up, she felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that came after a successful operation. But she also felt something else, a growing sense that the approach she had taken to this conflict might not be sufficient for what lay ahead. That evening, as Alina made her rounds checking on patients, she overheard a conversation between 2 wounded soldiers. They were discussing recent intelligence reports suggesting that enemy forces were planning a major offensive targeting medical facilities. The international laws of war were supposed to protect hospitals and medical personnel, but this conflict had already shown a disregard for such conventions. Alina felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that her work carried inherent risks, but the possibility of being deliberately targeted added a new dimension to those dangers. She thought about her medical team, about the patients who depended on them, about the oath she had taken to do no harm. As she prepared for sleep that night, Alina had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, she would face a choice that would test every principle she held dear and transform her from healer to something entirely different. The war was about to demand more from her than she had ever imagined possible, and her response would echo through the corridors of military history for decades to come. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning in March. Alina was checking on a patient when the first mortar round exploded just outside the medical compound's perimeter. The blast shook the tent violently, sending medical supplies crashing to the floor. Within seconds, the distant pop of automatic weapons fire filled the air. Sergeant Rodriguez burst through the tent flap, his face grim and his rifle at the ready. "Doc, we need to evacuate the critical patients now," he shouted over the growing noise of battle. "Intelligence was wrong. This isn't a probe, it's a full assault, and they're coming straight for us." Alina's training kicked in immediately. She had drilled for this scenario countless times, but the reality was more chaotic than any simulation. She began barking orders to her medical team, prioritizing which patients could be moved and which were too critical to transport. The sound of gunfire was growing closer, punctuated by the whistle and crash of incoming mortars. Nurse Sarah Chen, a petite woman with nerves of steel, appeared at Alina's side. "The helicopter pad is taking fire," she reported. "No medical evacuations possible right now." Alina felt her heart sink. Without air transport, they were trapped with patients who needed immediate surgical intervention. She looked around the tent at the 23 wounded soldiers currently under their care. Some were conscious and aware of the danger, their eyes wide with fear. Others were sedated or unconscious, completely dependent on the medical team for survival. The battle raged for 3 hours. Alina and her team continued treating patients while the sound of combat drew steadily closer. Marcus and his security team were putting up fierce resistance, but they were vastly outnumbered. Alina could hear the distinctive crack of sniper rifles mixing with the chatter of machine guns. Through gaps in the tent, she could see muzzle flashes in the distance. Around noon, Marcus appeared again, this time with blood running down his left arm. "We're falling back to the inner perimeter," he said. "The enemy has taken the outer fence. Doc, I need you to understand something. They're not following the Geneva Convention. They're specifically targeting medical personnel." Alina's blood ran cold. She had worked in conflict zones before, but always with the assumption that her medical status provided some protection. The idea that she and her team were being hunted specifically because they were doctors violated everything she believed about the rules of war. "How long can you hold them?" she asked. Marcus looked at her with the honesty that comes in desperate moments. "Maybe an hour, 2 at the most. We're down to 8 men and we're almost out of ammunition." Alina made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Sarah, get the mobile patients ready for evacuation on foot. Take them to the secondary rally point we discussed." She turned to Dr. Kim, the other physician on duty. "You go with them. I'll stay with the critical cases." "Alina, that's suicide," Dr. Kim protested. "If you stay, you'll be captured or killed." Alina looked at the 5 patients who couldn't be moved, 3 with spinal injuries and 2 in post-operative comas. "Someone has to stay with them. They can't defend themselves." As her team prepared for evacuation, Alina found herself alone with her most critical patients. The sound of battle was now just outside the medical compound. She could hear shouted commands in a language she didn't recognize, and the return fire from Marcus's dwindling security force. Then came the moment that would change everything. Alina heard footsteps approaching the medical tent, accompanied by harsh voices speaking in urgent tones. She moved to the tent entrance and saw 3 enemy soldiers advancing across the compound courtyard. They were clearly targeting the medical facility, their weapons raised and their intentions unmistakable. Behind them, she could see Marcus taking cover behind a concrete barrier. He had a clear shot at the approaching soldiers, but Alina realized with growing horror that he was wounded worse than he had admitted. His rifle was shaking in his hands, and she could see blood pooling beneath him. The enemy soldiers were now 50 yards from the medical tent. Alina's patients lay helpless behind her. She thought about her medical oath, about her commitment to preserving life. But she also thought about the 5 men and women who would certainly die if these soldiers reached the tent. Without fully understanding what she was doing, Alina picked up Marcus's backup rifle from where he had left it near the tent entrance. The weapon felt impossibly heavy in her hands. She had never held a gun before, let alone fired one. But some instinct born of desperation guided her movements as she checked the safety and adjusted her grip. The lead enemy soldier was now 30 yards away. Alina could see his face clearly, could see the determination in his eyes as he approached the medical facility. She thought about her patients, about her oath, about the choice between action and inaction. In that moment, she understood that sometimes the greatest act of healing required the willingness to cause harm. Alina raised the rifle, feeling its weight settle against her shoulder. The soldier was 25 yards away. Her hands were shaking, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had no training, no experience, no understanding of windage or bullet drop or any of the technical aspects of marksmanship. But she had something else: absolute clarity of purpose. These men were here to kill her patients, to murder helpless people under her care. Alina's finger found the trigger, and for the first time in her life, she prepared to take a human life. The rifle bucked in her hands with surprising violence. The sound was deafening, much louder than she had expected. Through the smoke and confusion, she saw the enemy soldier stumble and fall. His companions immediately took cover, shouting commands to each other. Alina had no time to process what she had done. The other soldiers were now returning fire, bullets whistling past the tent opening. She worked the bolt action clumsily, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round. Her medical training had taught her to work under pressure, but this was different. This was life and death in the most immediate sense. The second soldier appeared from behind cover, trying to flank around to the side of the medical tent. Alina tracked him with the rifle, leading his movement the way her intuition told her to. She squeezed the trigger again, and again the weapon kicked against her shoulder. This time she saw the impact more clearly, saw the soldier spin and drop. Marcus, despite his wounds, had managed to engage the third soldier from his position behind the barrier. Alina heard the rapid fire of his assault rifle, followed by silence. The immediate threat was over, but she knew it was only temporary. As Alina lowered the rifle, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She had just killed 2 human beings. The woman who had dedicated her life to healing had become an instrument of death in the span of less than 2 minutes. She felt simultaneously horrified by her actions and grimly satisfied that her patients were safe. Marcus appeared beside her, his face pale from blood loss but his eyes showing respect she had never seen before. "Nice shooting, Doc," he said. "Where did you learn to handle a rifle like that?" Alina looked down at the weapon in her hands, still not quite believing what had happened. "I didn't," she said. "I've never fired a gun before in my life." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible. You made 2 clean kills at distance under stress with iron sights. Nobody's that good on their first try." Alina didn't have an answer for him. She didn't understand what had happened any more than he did. All she knew was that when faced with an impossible choice, something inside her had responded with deadly precision. She had discovered a capacity for violence she never knew existed, and the realization both terrified and empowered her. The battle was far from over. Alina could hear more enemy forces regrouping in the distance, preparing for another assault. She looked at her patients, still helpless and depending on her for their survival. Then she looked at the rifle in her hands, at the tool that had saved their lives. For the first time since arriving in this war zone, Alina began to understand that healing and killing might not be opposite forces after all. Sometimes, she realized, they were 2 sides of the same desperate coin. The counterattack came 6 hours later. Alina had spent those hours learning everything she could about the rifle that had saved her patients' lives. Marcus, despite his injuries, had given her a crash course in basic marksmanship principles. She learned about sight alignment, breathing techniques, and the importance of trigger control. But more importantly, she learned to trust the instincts that had emerged during her first encounter with combat. Word of the medical compound's successful defense had spread through military channels. Reinforcements arrived just before sunset. 2 squads of battle-hardened soldiers led by Captain James Morrison, a career officer with 15 years of combat experience. Morrison was initially skeptical when Marcus reported that a civilian doctor had made 2 long-range kills with unfamiliar equipment. "Show me exactly where it happened," Morrison said, surveying the courtyard where Alina had made her stand. Marcus pointed to the tent entrance where Alina had taken her position, then indicated where the enemy soldiers had fallen. Morrison paced off the distance, his expression growing more serious with each step. The first kill had been made at 47 yards, the second at 33 yards. Both were single shots to center mass, with no wasted ammunition. "This is impressive marksmanship for anyone," Morrison admitted. "For a civilian with no training, it's almost impossible to believe." Alina overheard the conversation as she finished treating a wounded soldier who had arrived with the reinforcements. She felt uncomfortable with the attention her actions were receiving. She had acted out of necessity, not from any desire for military glory. Her primary concern remained the welfare of her patients. But events were moving beyond her control. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy forces had not retreated. They had regrouped and were planning another assault on the medical facility. This time, they would come in greater numbers and with heavier weapons. The small garrison of soldiers now protecting the compound would not be sufficient to repel a determined attack. Morrison approached Alina that evening as she made her rounds checking on patients. "Dr. Vasquez, I need to discuss something with you," he said. "Our situation here is more precarious than you might realize. We're isolated, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that seems particularly focused on eliminating this medical facility." Alina looked up from the patient she was treating, a young soldier who had taken shrapnel to his legs. "What are you suggesting, Captain?" "I'm suggesting that your skills might be needed for more than medical care. That shooting today wasn't luck. Marcus tells me you've got natural ability he's rarely seen. We could use someone with your precision." Alina felt a chill run through her. "I'm a doctor, Captain. I took an oath to heal people, not kill them." Morrison's expression remained serious but sympathetic. "I understand your position, Doc, but sometimes we have to choose between competing responsibilities. You've got patients here who will die if this facility falls. Your medical skills won't mean much if you're all dead." That night, Alina lay awake considering Morrison's words. She thought about her medical oath, about her commitment to preserving life. But she also thought about the helpless patients depending on her, about the reality of their tactical situation. The enemy had made it clear they would not respect the protected status of medical personnel. In such circumstances, what did her oath truly require? The answer came to her in the early hours of the morning, as she watched over a comatose patient whose life hung in the balance. Her oath required her to protect life by whatever means necessary. If that meant taking lives to save lives, then perhaps that was what she was called to do. Alina found Morrison at dawn, as he reviewed defensive positions with his sergeants. "Captain, if you're serious about that offer, I'd like to learn more about marksmanship." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you sure about this, Doc? Once you cross that line, there's no going back." Alina thought about the enemy soldiers she had killed the day before, about the immediate clarity she had felt in that moment of crisis. "I think I've already crossed it." Morrison assigned Sergeant Rodriguez to work with Alina during the lulls between medical duties. Despite his wounds, Marcus was determined to help her develop the skills that might save their lives. They started with basic rifle maintenance, teaching Alina how to clean and care for the weapon that would become her tool of survival. Alina proved to be an exceptional student. Her medical training had given her steady hands and the ability to work under pressure. More importantly, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to read distance and compensate for environmental factors. Marcus had seen talented shooters before, but Alina's natural ability bordered on the impossible. During her third training session, Alina consistently hit targets at ranges that would challenge experienced soldiers. Her shooting wasn't just accurate, it was precise in ways that defied explanation. Each shot grouped tightly around the center of the target, with minimal deviation despite changing wind conditions and lighting. "I've been training soldiers for 12 years, Marcus told Morrison after observing one of Alina's practice sessions. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like she can see things the rest of us can't." Morrison was equally impressed. "Maybe we should think about utilizing this talent more strategically. The enemy is planning something big. Our intelligence suggests they're bringing in specialist units to take out this facility once and for all." The specialist units arrived 2 days later. Alina was checking on a patient when she heard Marcus's urgent voice over the radio. "Enemy snipers in position on the ridgeline, 200 yards northeast of the compound." Alina looked out from the medical tent and could see the rocky outcropping where the enemy shooters had taken position. They were well concealed, almost invisible against the backdrop of stone and shadow. But Alina's eyes had learned to pick up details that others missed: the barely perceptible gleam of a rifle scope, the subtle movement of fabric against stone. Without being asked, Alina picked up her rifle and moved to a position that offered a clear line of sight to the ridgeline. The enemy snipers were professional soldiers, trained in the art of long-distance killing. They represented a threat not just to the medical facility, but to every person within their range. Alina studied the target area through her rifle's scope. The distance was nearly 300 yards, far beyond what most people would consider possible for someone with only days of formal training. But Alina had learned to trust her instincts, to rely on the same intuitive understanding that had guided her first kills. She found her target, a figure barely visible against the rocks, distinguishable only by the metallic glint of his rifle and the subtle movement as he adjusted his position. Alina calculated wind drift, elevation, and the dozen other factors that determine the flight of a bullet over long distance. Then she did something that would have been impossible to explain to anyone watching. She simply knew where to aim. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with familiar authority. 300 yards away, the enemy sniper slumped forward, his weapon clattering against the rocks. Alina worked the bolt, chambered another round, and began searching for the second sniper. She found him 30 seconds later, as he tried to relocate to a more secure position. This shot was even more challenging, a moving target at maximum range, partially concealed by rocky cover. Alina led the target, compensated for his movement, and squeezed the trigger with the same instinctive certainty that had characterized all her shooting. The second sniper fell, and with him, the immediate threat to the compound. Alina lowered her rifle, feeling the familiar mixture of satisfaction and horror that accompanied each successful engagement. She was becoming something she had never intended to be, a precision killer with abilities that defied conventional understanding. Morrison appeared at her position minutes later, his face showing a mixture of admiration and concern. "That was incredible shooting, Doc. 300 yards, 2 moving targets, perfect conditions for a shot. How did you do it?" Alina looked at the rifle in her hands, at the tool that had become an extension of her will. "I don't know," she said honestly. "When I look through the scope, I can see exactly where the bullet needs to go. It's like my medical training, but different. Instead of seeing what's wrong with a patient, I can see exactly where to place a shot." Over the following weeks, Alina's reputation began to spread beyond the confines of their isolated outpost. Military intelligence units began requesting her assistance with specific targets: enemy commanders, weapons specialists, and other high-value individuals whose elimination could significantly impact the broader conflict. Alina found herself caught between her medical obligations and her evolving role as a precision shooter. She continued treating wounded soldiers during the day, but increasingly found herself called upon to eliminate threats that conventional forces couldn't handle. Her shooting had become so accurate, so consistently deadly, that she was being referred to in intelligence briefings as a strategic asset. The transformation from healer to hunter was complete, though Alina herself didn't fully recognize it yet. She still thought of herself primarily as a doctor who happened to be skilled with a rifle. But others saw something different. They saw the emergence of a legendary figure, someone whose abilities transcended normal human limitations. The war was about to escalate in ways that would test Alina's skills to their absolute limit and force her to confront the full implications of the path she had chosen. The mission that would cement Alina's legend came 6 weeks after her first kill. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, Colonel Dmitry Volkov, an enemy commander responsible for ordering attacks on civilian hospitals and medical facilities throughout the region. Volkov had personally orchestrated the campaign to eliminate medical personnel, viewing them as legitimate military targets despite international law. Colonel Morrison briefed Alina on the mission parameters in his field command post, surrounded by maps and intelligence photographs. "Volkov will be inspecting forward positions tomorrow at 800 hours, Morrison explained. "He travels with a full security detail and rarely exposes himself for more than a few seconds at a time." Alina studied the surveillance photos showing Volkov's typical convoy formation. The target was a career soldier, paranoid about snipers and trained in counter-surveillance techniques. He varied his routes, used decoy vehicles, and never followed predictable patterns. Taking him out would require a shot of exceptional difficulty under nearly impossible conditions. "What's the range?" Alina asked, her medical mind automatically calculating variables and probabilities. "Between 600 and 800 yards, depending on which route he takes. The shot window will be maybe 3 seconds maximum. You'll have one opportunity, and if you miss, he'll disappear underground for months." Alina had never attempted a shot at such extreme range. Even professional military snipers would consider it a challenging engagement. But something in her core told her it was possible, the same intuitive understanding that had guided all her previous shots. She spent the remainder of the day preparing. Alina studied wind patterns, temperature variations, and atmospheric conditions. She calculated bullet trajectory over the expected range, factoring in the specific ballistics of her ammunition. But more importantly, she prepared herself mentally for what would be the most difficult shot of her life. That evening, Alina made her way to the shooting position Morrison's scouts had identified, a rocky outcropping that offered clear lines of sight to all three possible convoy routes. She carried not just her rifle, but a full medical kit. Even as she prepared to kill, she couldn't abandon her identity as a healer. Sergeant Martinez, Morrison's best spotter, accompanied her to the position. Martinez was a veteran with 8 years of sniper experience, and he had initially been skeptical about working with a civilian. But Alina's reputation for impossible shots had earned his respect. "Doc, I have to ask," Martinez said as they settled into position. "How do you do it? I've seen snipers with 20 years experience who can't shoot like you do." Alina adjusted her rifle scope, checking the clarity of her sight picture. "When I was in medical school, I learned to see things others couldn't, subtle changes in a patient's condition, early warning signs of complications. It's like that, but different. When I look through this scope, I can see exactly where the bullet needs to go." They waited through the night, taking turns on watch while monitoring radio communications for updates on Volkov's movements. Alina found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this position. 3 months ago, she had been treating patients and saving lives. Now she was preparing to kill a man from nearly half a mile away. At 600 hours, intelligence confirmed that Volkov's convoy was moving toward the inspection route. Alina settled behind her rifle, adjusting her position for maximum stability. The morning air was still, with minimal wind drift to complicate her calculations. Conditions were as perfect as she could hope for. Martinez scanned the approaches through high-powered binoculars, searching for the first sign of the convoy. "Movement on the eastern road," he reported. 3 vehicles armored matching the profile. Alina tracked her rifle toward the expected intercept point, a section of road where Volkov's vehicle would be exposed for approximately 4 seconds. The range was 743 yards, further than she had ever shot before, but still within the bounds of possibility. The convoy appeared exactly as intelligence had predicted. Volkov rode in the middle vehicle, a heavily armored truck designed to withstand small arms fire and explosive devices. Alina could see him through the vehicle's reinforced windows, a figure in military uniform studying documents while his driver navigated the rough terrain. "Target confirmed," Martinez whispered. "Volkov in the middle vehicle, passenger side." Alina centered her crosshairs on the vehicle's window, calculating the precise point where her bullet needed to strike. She controlled her breathing, letting her heart rate slow to its minimum. At this range, even the slightest movement would send her shot wide of the mark. The convoy approached the kill zone at exactly the predicted speed. Alina tracked the target vehicle, leading it slightly to compensate for its movement. Through her scope, she could see Volkov clearly now, a man in his 50s with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Range 743 yards, Martinez confirmed. "Wind negligible, target approaching the window." Alina's finger found the trigger, applying steady pressure while maintaining perfect sight alignment. The world narrowed to the small circle visible through her scope. In that circle, she could see not just her target, but the precise point where physics and ballistics would converge. The shot broke with surprising clarity. Alina felt the rifle's recoil, heard the sharp crack of the cartridge, and saw the muzzle flash that briefly obscured her sight picture. When the smoke cleared, she could see the convoy's middle vehicle swerving erratically before coming to a complete stop. Martinez was watching through his binoculars, providing real-time assessment. "Hit confirmed, target vehicle stopped, personnel dismounting from lead and trail vehicles." He paused, studying the scene more carefully. "Doc, I think you got him. Clean hit through the window." Intelligence confirmation came 20 minutes later via encrypted radio. Colonel Volkov was dead, killed by a single bullet that had penetrated the supposedly bulletproof glass of his command vehicle and struck him in the chest. The man responsible for targeting medical personnel throughout the region would never order another attack on civilian hospitals. Alina lowered her rifle, feeling the familiar mixture of satisfaction and revulsion that accompanied each successful mission. She had eliminated a genuine threat to medical personnel throughout the theater, potentially saving hundreds of lives. But she had also taken another human life with premeditated precision. "That was an impossible shot," Martinez said, shaking his head in amazement. 743 yards, moving target, armored glass. I've never seen anything like it." Word of Alina's achievement spread rapidly through military channels. The elimination of Volkov was considered a significant tactical victory, disrupting enemy operations and sending a clear message about the consequences of targeting medical personnel. But more than that, it established Alina's reputation as something unprecedented, a medical doctor who could make kills that challenged the world's best military snipers. Within days, requests began arriving from commanders throughout the region. Everyone wanted Alina's assistance with their most difficult targets, their most challenging tactical problems. She was no longer just a doctor who happened to be skilled with a rifle. She was being recognized as a strategic asset with unique capabilities. Alina found herself facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could return to her medical duties, treating wounded soldiers and saving lives in the traditional sense. Or she could embrace this new role, using her extraordinary shooting abilities to eliminate threats and protect the innocent on a scale that conventional medicine could never achieve. The decision was made easier by events beyond her control. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were specifically hunting for the sniper who had killed Colonel Volkov. They had placed a substantial bounty on Alina's head and were deploying specialist counter-sniper teams to eliminate her. Colonel Morrison met with Alina in the medical tent, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard by the patients. "Doc, you're a marked woman now. They know who you are and they're coming for you. You can't go back to being just a medical officer." Alina looked around the tent at her patients, at the wounded soldiers who still needed her medical skills. "What are you suggesting, Colonel?" "I'm suggesting that your war has changed. You've become something unique, a healer who kills to protect life. The enemy is terrified of you, and our forces see you as something approaching legendary. Like it or not, you're not just Dr. Vasquez anymore." That evening, as Alina prepared for what she knew would be another sleepless night, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past few months. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she never knew existed, had crossed lines she never imagined she would cross, and had become someone she barely recognized. But as she looked at her patients, at the lives she had saved both through medicine and through marksmanship, Alina began to understand that perhaps this was who she was meant to become. Perhaps the healer and the hunter were not contradictory roles, but different aspects of the same fundamental commitment to preserving life. The war was far from over, and Alina's legend was just beginning to grow. Soon, soldiers on both sides would speak her name in whispers, some with fear and others with awe. She was becoming something that had never existed before, an angel of mercy who delivered death with divine precision. But first, she would have to survive the hunters who were coming for her. The hunters came for Alina 3 weeks after Volkov's death. Intelligence had warned that enemy special forces were deploying counter-sniper teams, specifically, to eliminate the mysterious shooter who had become a symbol of resistance throughout the region. What they didn't anticipate was how completely Alina had embraced her transformation from healer to legendary marksman. Alina was no longer the hesitant doctor who had picked up a rifle out of desperation. Months of combat had sharpened her instincts and refined her skills to an almost supernatural degree. She moved through the compound with the fluid grace of someone who understood violence as intimately as she understood medicine. Her rifle had become an extension of her body, as natural and familiar as a stethoscope had once been. The first assassination attempt came at dawn on a Thursday morning. Alina was making her rounds in the medical tent when Sergeant Martinez burst through the entrance, his face urgent with warning. "Doc, we've got movement on the northern ridge. Professional setup, probably counter-sniper team." Alina immediately transitioned from medical mode to combat readiness. She handed her patient clipboard to Nurse Chen and moved to the equipment locker where she kept her rifle. The weapon was always clean, always loaded, always ready for immediate use. She had learned that in war, hesitation measured in seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Moving to her established overwatch position, Alina studied the northern ridge through her scope. At first, she saw nothing, just rocks and scrub vegetation baking in the morning heat. But her trained eyes picked up subtle inconsistencies. A shadow that didn't match the sun's angle, a patch of vegetation that looked slightly different from its surroundings. "Two positions," she reported to Martinez. "Ridge line approximately 600 yards. They're good, almost invisible." Martinez confirmed the sighting through his spotting scope. "Professional work. These aren't regular soldiers. This is a dedicated hunter-killer team." Alina had faced enemy snipers before, but this was different. These men had come specifically for her, armed with intelligence about her capabilities and tactics. They knew her reputation, her preferred shooting positions, her methods. This would be a battle between professionals, with no margin for error on either side. The enemy snipers were patient, waiting for Alina to expose herself for a clear shot. But Alina had learned patience too, along with all the other deadly skills that war had taught her. She studied their positions, calculating angles and distances, looking for the smallest advantage that would allow her to strike first. Hours passed in tense silence. The enemy snipers remained motionless in their concealed positions, while Alina waited for the perfect opportunity to engage. She had learned that the best snipers were distinguished not by their shooting ability, but by their patience and tactical intelligence. The break came when one of the enemy snipers adjusted his position slightly, probably to relieve cramped muscles after hours of immobility. The movement was minimal, just a few inches, but it was enough to give Alina the angle she needed. She centered her crosshairs on the barely visible target, compensating for wind, distance, and the heat shimmer that distorted her sight picture. At 600 yards, through camouflage and cover, it was an extremely difficult shot. But Alina had stopped thinking in terms of difficult or impossible. She simply saw where the bullet needed to go and trusted her skills to put it there. The rifle cracked, and Alina immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round. Through her scope, she saw the first enemy sniper slump forward, his camouflage position now revealed by his motionless body. One down, but the second sniper was still a threat. The remaining enemy shooter was more cautious, having witnessed his partner's death. He began moving to a new position, using cover and concealment to mask his location. Alina tracked his movement, anticipating where he would emerge for his own shot. When he appeared, it was only for a fraction of a second, just long enough to acquire a target and fire. But Alina was ready, her crosshairs already centered on the spot where instinct told her he would appear. Her second shot followed immediately after his, two bullets passing each other in the morning air. Alina felt the enemy's bullet whistle past her head, missing by inches. Her own shot found its mark, and the second sniper dropped from sight. The immediate threat was eliminated, but Alina knew this was only the beginning. More teams would come, better equipped and more determined. Over the following months, Alina's reputation grew beyond the bounds of normal military recognition. Soldiers from both sides began telling stories about her that bordered on the mythical. They called her the Angel of Death, a figure who could strike from impossible distances with perfect accuracy. Enemy forces started offering substantial rewards for information about her location, while Allied troops considered her presence a guarantee of survival. Alina's actual kill count during this period became a matter of military legend. Official records credited her with 43 confirmed enemy kills, including senior officers, specialist snipers, and high-value targets. But unofficial accounts put the number much higher, and included engagements that defied conventional understanding of marksmanship. There were reports of Alina making successful shots at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, of hitting targets in complete darkness using only muzzle flashes for reference, of eliminating multiple threats with rapid-fire precision that challenged the limitations of her bolt-action rifle. Some of these accounts were certainly exaggerated, but enough were verified by multiple witnesses to establish Alina as something unprecedented in military history. More importantly, Alina's presence fundamentally altered the tactical situation in her area of operations. Enemy forces became reluctant to operate in daylight, knowing that any exposed position might put them in her crosshairs. Attacks on medical facilities ceased entirely after she eliminated 3 separate teams that had targeted hospitals. The mere possibility of facing Alina was enough to change enemy behavior patterns throughout the region. But the psychological toll of her transformation was becoming increasingly evident. Alina still performed her medical duties with the same skill and compassion that had always defined her, but something essential had changed. She carried herself with the deadly confidence of a predator, and her eyes held a hardness that hadn't existed before the war. Late one evening, as Alina cleaned her rifle after a particularly challenging engagement, Nurse Chen approached her with obvious concern. "Alina, I'm worried about you. You're not the same person who arrived here 2 years ago." Alina looked up from her weapon maintenance, meeting her colleague's eyes with a steady gaze. "None of us are the same people we were 2 years ago, Sarah. War changes everyone. But not like this. You become something different, something dangerous. Sometimes I see you looking at people like you're calculating range and wind speed." Alina considered this observation carefully. It was true that her perception had changed, that she saw the world through the lens of tactical possibilities and threat assessment. But she didn't see this as a loss of humanity. She saw it as an expansion of her capability to protect life. "I haven't stopped being a doctor," Alina said. "I've just learned additional ways to heal the world." The final engagement that would cement Alina's legend came during the war's climactic battle. Enemy forces had launched a massive offensive designed to capture the strategic port city that served as the main supply hub for Allied operations. Alina was attached to a medical unit supporting the defensive efforts when intelligence reported that enemy commanders had positioned themselves in a fortified observation post to direct the assault. The observation post was located in a church tower, 2 miles behind enemy lines and heavily defended. Conventional forces couldn't reach it, and airstrikes were impossible due to surface-to-air missile coverage. But someone with Alina's unique skills might be able to make the shot that could disrupt the enemy's entire offensive. Colonel Morrison, now a general after his promotion, personally briefed Alina on the mission. "It's a 1,000-yard shot through an urban environment with multiple obstacles and wind patterns. The target window will be minimal, and you'll be operating alone behind enemy lines." Alina studied the intelligence photos and topographical maps, calculating angles and trajectories with the precision that had become second nature. "What's the tactical value of this shot, General?" Intelligence believes the enemy commander directing this offensive is General Kruger himself. Take him out, and their entire assault loses coordination and leadership. It could save thousands of lives on both sides. Alina spent 3 days infiltrating behind enemy lines, moving at night and hiding during daylight hours. She carried minimal equipment, just her rifle, ammunition, and basic survival gear. Her medical training had taught her how to survive on limited resources, skills that proved invaluable for this solo mission. The shot would have to be taken from a bombed-out apartment building that offered a clear line of sight to the church tower. Alina established her position in the early morning hours, calculating the complex ballistics required for such an extreme-range shot. She would have to account for wind patterns affected by urban structures, temperature variations throughout the day, and the rotation of the Earth itself. Through her scope, Alina could see figures moving within the church tower's observation deck. Intelligence photos helped her identify General Kruger, a tall man with distinctive posture and mannerisms. But at 1,000 yards, even with her exceptional vision, positive identification would be challenging. Alina waited for 6 hours, watching the patterns of movement within the tower. She learned to recognize Kruger's habits, his preferred position near the eastern window, the way he gestured while giving orders. When the moment came, she would have perhaps 2 seconds to identify her target and make the shot. The opportunity appeared just after noon, when Kruger moved to his characteristic position near the eastern window. Alina had been preparing for this moment for hours, and her body responded with the fluid precision of perfect training. She controlled her breathing, aligned her sight picture, and squeezed the trigger with the same instinctive certainty that had characterized all her legendary shots. The bullet's flight time at that range was nearly 2 seconds. Alina watched through her scope as General Kruger suddenly staggered and fell from sight. Moments later, she could see increased activity within the tower as personnel rushed to assist their fallen commander. The tactical impact of Alina's shot was immediate and decisive. Without Kruger's leadership, the enemy offensive lost coordination and momentum. Allied forces were able to mount successful counterattacks that ultimately broke the siege and ended the war's major combat operations. When Alina returned to Allied lines 3 days later, she found herself facing a transformation she hadn't expected. News of her incredible shot had spread throughout the military, elevating her from respected sniper to genuine legend. She was no longer just Dr. Alina Vasquez, who happened to be skilled with a rifle. She had become a symbol of precision, dedication, and the complex morality of modern warfare. In the months that followed the war's end, Alina faced choices about her future that she had never anticipated. Military leaders offered her positions in elite units, intelligence agencies wanted to study her methods, and medical schools sought to understand how a healer had become one of history's most effective snipers. But Alina ultimately chose to return to medicine, though she never abandoned the skills that war had taught her. She established a trauma center specializing in the treatment of combat injuries, drawing on her unique understanding of both the weapons that create wounds and the techniques needed to heal them. Years later, when asked about her transformation from doctor to legendary sniper, Alina would reflect on the complex relationship between healing and violence, between protection and aggression. She had learned that sometimes the greatest act of compassion requires the willingness to cause harm, and that the skills needed to preserve life sometimes mirror those needed to end it. The war had revealed capabilities within her that she never knew existed, had tested her principles in ways she never imagined possible, and had ultimately shown her that heroism often requires accepting contradictions that cannot be easily resolved. Alina Vasquez had become the angel of death, and in doing so, had saved more lives than she could count.